For our fashion history project for the 1920s, I was in charge of creating our designers and talking a bit about them. So first we have Madeleine Vionnet. She was born in 1876 and died in 1975. She actually is like one of the people that I studied that actually ended up having a really hard life throughout her entire life. And she, at age 12, began an apprenticeship as a seamstress. And when she was younger, her parents actually divorced. And so she had a hard life growing up as well. When she was 18, she was married, she had a child, her child died, and she was divorced. That all happened when she was 18. And then after all of that happened, she decided to go to London and work at a hospital as a seamstress. She eventually returned to Paris, where she was originally from, and worked in the fashion house called Soeurs as a toil maker. She almost left, but was convinced to stay by a promotion to improvise draped designs on a live model. She actually eventually founded her own fashion house called Vionnet after her own last name. This ended up closing at the beginning of 1914 because of World War I. And then in 1923, she opened her new fashion house that became known as the Temple of Fashion. And she ended up expanding this to New York City in 1925. But in 1939, she once again was forced to close her fashion house due to World War II, and she retired in 1940. Madeleine is actually famous for creating the bias cut dress, which changed the shape of women's fashion forever. Here you can see some of the dresses and the types that she created. I think her dresses are very elegant and beautiful, and she had such a unique style to her, and I think it helped that she had a hard life growing up because she figured out what she wanted, and she knew what beauty was, and she wanted to see that. So next is Elsa Schiaparelli, and she was born in 1890 and then died in 1973. Elsa was more of a rebellious type of person throughout her entire life. This started in her childhood and went all throughout her adult years. She was actually fascinated with ancient cultures and religion rites. These things inspired her to write crazy poems, and her poems honestly alarmed her parents, and so they ended up sending her to a boarding school in Switzerland. She, not surprisingly, turned out to be rebellious at the school as well and went on a hunger strike that actually forced her parents to take her back home. She ended up running away to London because her parents wanted her to marry a wealthy Russian who she was not attracted to. She eventually got married to another man in 1914, and her husband left her after their first kid, and she always told her daughter that her father had died. In 1922, she left America, and moved back to France. She ended up creating the House of Schiaparelli in Paris in 1927. She managed this house from the 30s to the 50s, so for quite a long time. Her designs honored Surrealism, which was a movement happening in Europe after the First World War. Artists depicted alarming and irrational scenes, and they used techniques that spoke and showed their minds. And basically, fashion was eccentric. She was famous for artistic themes like the human body, bugs, and bright colors. So as you can see on the picture to the right, that is Elsa, but you can see the big brooch or bug, whatever you want to call it, on her outfit. And here are some of the dresses that she created. You can see there's the lobster on the one on the right, so she was very eccentric in her fashion designs. Next is Edward Mullinex. He was born in 1891 and died in 1974. Edward's father actually passed away when he was 16, which led him to leave school, and he had to support him and his mother. And while he was doing that, he decided to pursue his interest in painting and illustrating. He was first employed as a sketch artist for the London edition of the American magazine titled The Smart Set. Lucille Cristiano was very interested in Edward and hired him as a sketcher for her salon in London. He was promoted to assistant designer very soon after that. He also worked for her in New York. When the First World War started, he fought in the Battle of Arras. He attained the rank of a captain, but actually ended up losing sight in one eye. He went back to work with Lucille, but they had a disagreement, and he was basically forced to leave after that disagreement. He opened his fashion house in Paris and expanded to Monte Carlo, Cannes, and London over the years. He was also known for his simplicity and actually dressed royals and movie stars. So here's some of his dresses, super simple. I think, in my opinion, he was more of like a sketching type person. So he was a famous designer at some point, but I think some of his designs reflect his sketching as well. And last but not least is Marcel Rojas. He was born in 1902 and died in 1955, so he lived a very short life. He's known for creating a more free fashion style that helped women feel more free, and he opened his first fashion house in 1920. Some of his fashion pieces are unheard of and out of this world. His designs are pretty unique. And after the Second World War, he went to test his luck in America. He moved to Hollywood and worked with movie stars. One of the famous movie stars was Mae West. He got into the world of perfume and actually later started working on perfume later in his life. He is famous for the 2/3, or known as the 3/4 length coat, as well as the skirt with pockets, which is still famous to this day, as now we know dresses with pockets are quite famous.
Hello.
Okay,
I'm going to talk a little bit about the history that happened during the 1920s. To start off, I wanted to talk about the Wall Street bombing. The Wall Street bombing in the 1920s was known as the worst terrorist attack up to that point in history. It occurred in the afternoon on September 16th in New York City. When the bomb went off, it immediately killed 30 people, and later 10 were pronounced dead due to their injuries. The interesting thing about the Wall Street bombing is that the case was never officially solved. Investigators had assumptions and suspicions about who it was, which they believed to be the Galleonists, but they still don't know for sure. The Wall Street bombing was related to post-war issues such as labor struggles and anti-capitalization allegations. The 1920s were an amazing time for the women. They officially gained the right to vote. Technically, the bill was passed in 1919, but it wasn't ratified until the 1920s. As you can see in this picture, there were a lot of protests. There were a lot of unhappy women who faced a lot of struggles. They faced a lot of agitation and just unfair equal rights. So when this bill was passed, it was a huge milestone, and it took decades to finally get it passed. In 1920, the Constitution was also amended twice. These were the 18th and 19th Amendments of the Constitution. The 18th Amendment had to do with the Prohibition, which prohibited the making, selling, or transporting of intoxicating liquors like alcohol. The 19th Amendment actually was women's suffrage, which goes back to when women gained the right to vote. So something else that happened in the 1920s is the KKK terrorized the United States. By mid-1920s, the KKK had grown immensely in membership. It was a range of 3 to 8 million Klansmen. They decided that they wanted to try and take over the government, and they created a strategy called the Decade, which meant that every member was to recruit and convince 10 people to vote for a member of the KKK in elections. In 1924, unfortunately, they were successful in this strategy. Members from the KKK were elected from coast to coast. They had enough of their members in power to be able to control the state government. They were also known as the Invisible Empire. Another cool thing about the 1920s is this right here is Edith Wilson. She is Woodrow Wilson's wife. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th president of the United States. And during his second term in his presidency, he had a severe stroke, which took away his ability to effectively run the country and be able to perform his presidential duties. Instead of stepping down, they actually had Edith serve as what they called was the secret president. The people to push her was actually President Wilson's doctors. In a memoir that was published in 1939, it said that Edith stated that her husband's doctors were the ones who urged this course upon her. I think it was actually really cool, though, because she was very successful in her presidential time. She screened all matters of the state, and she functionally ran the executive branch of government for the remainder of President Wilson's second term in office, which I think is just absolutely amazing. But that is just a little bit of history from the 1920s. I hope you enjoyed.
All right, so in the 1920s, there was many different types of clothing characteristics. Some of them included loose-fitting clothing, dropped waistlines on dresses and other trousers, and shorter hems, loose-fitting pants on women, long and lean structures of clothing, and overall androgynous appearance. The 1920s men fashion had well-tailored pinstripe suits, so a lot of suits, tuxedos too, silk shirts and handkerchiefs, raccoon fur coats, fedoras, suspenders, bow ties, and black patent leather shoes. So a lot of it was very dressy, and it kind of like showed the business model that people wear nowadays. 1920 women's fashion. There's a lot of short dresses, low-waisted dresses, bob hair, like Edna, cloche, I don't know how to say it, crochet hats, scarves, and floppers. It's a lot of fancy things and a lot of colors. Boys' clothing in the 1920s was plain and patterned button-ups, shirts, tops, tweed, plaid, or neutral-colored pants, suspenders, paperboy hats, dress, leather shoes, and high socks. Yeah, a lot of them were like little sailor boy type outfits. 1920s girls' clothing is loose, straight and slender, dropped waist, shorter hemlines, comfortable skirts, sailor blouses, and large brim hats. So a lot of the kids, they wore a lot of sailor-related clothing, and there's a lot of colors involved. And these are our sources, but yes, that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for watching.